I'm Nora, 28, female, and for my entire life, I have been the quiet echo in a house that only listened for my sister's voice. I just sat through her extravagant 30th birthday dinner after being told they didn't count me, when ordering food, only to watch them get handed an $8,750 bill they expected someone else to pay. This is the story of how a single napkin and a corner stool finally gave me the strength to break a lifetime of silence. The weight of being forgot is a strange thing. It's not a sudden, sharp pain. It's a slow, creeping cold that settles in your bones over years until you forget what it's like to feel truly warm. For me, that cold began so early that I have no memories without it. My life has been defined by the space I occupy in relation to my older sister, Chloe. She is the sun my family orbits around. I am the distant, barely visible moon, only noticed when I eclipse a tiny fraction of her light. I'm Nora, I'm 28, and I am a financial analyst. I am good with numbers because numbers are logical. They don't have favorites. An 8 is always an 8. It isn't worth more just because it's sitting next to a 9. In my family, however, value was always subjective, and Chloe's was always higher. To understand the events of that catastrophic birthday dinner, you have to understand the foundation it was built on. A foundation of casual dismissal and institutionalized favoritism that was as much a part of our home as the faded floral wallpaper in the hallway. I remember my 8th birthday. I had spent months dreaming of a telescope. I wanted to see the stars, to map the constellations, to look at something bigger than my own small world. I'd circled it in the Sears catalog, left hints, and whispered my wish to my mom, Helen, as she tucked me in at night. On my birthday morning, I was handed a small, neatly wrapped rectangle. It was a book, Great Expectations. My dad, Richard, patted me on the shoulder and said, "A classic for our classic girl." An hour later, a horse trailer pulled into our driveway. For Chloe, it was a beautiful chestnut pony with a white star on its forehead. It wasn't even her birthday. She was 10, and she had idly mentioned wanting a pony a week earlier. As she shrieked with joy and my parents beamed, I stood on the porch, clutching my book. My mother looked over at me, her smile faltering for just a second. She knelt down and smoothed my hair. "Be happy for your sister, sweetie," she whispered. "And be grateful for what you have. Some children don't even get books." The lesson was clear. My expectations were to be managed. Chloe's were to be exceeded. This pattern hardened as we grew older. College was the next great divider. Chloe had her heart set on an expensive private university on the other side of the country, not for its academic prestige, but for its social scene and renowned sororities. My parents liquidated savings bonds and took out a second mortgage to make it happen. Her 4 years there were a whirlwind of designer clothes, spring break trips to Cancun, and glossy photos of sorority formals that covered our refrigerator door. She graduated with a degree in communications and a mountain of debt my parents cheerfully began to pay off. 2 years later, when it was my turn, the family finances were a little tight. It was a phrase I would come to hear often. I was gently guided toward our local state school. "You're so practical, Nora," my father said with an air of admiration that felt like a consolation prize. "You'll make the smart choice." The smart choice meant living at home, working 2 part-time jobs to cover tuition and books, and studying in the library until it closed because our house was always buzzing with Chloe's friends. I majored in finance, driven by a quiet determination to build a life where I would never be dependent on the whims of others. I graduated with honors, a full-time job offer, and 0 debt. At my graduation party, a small backyard barbecue, my father toasted me. "To Nora," he'd said, holding up a can of beer. "Our independent girl, she did it all on her own." Everyone clapped, and I felt a familiar pang, the sting of praise that was really just an excuse for their lack of support. The final brick in this foundation was laid when Chloe married Mark. Mark was cut from the same cloth as her, charming on the surface, with a core of solid gold entitlement. He saw the way my parents doted on Chloe and leaned into it, becoming the son they'd always wanted. When they decided to buy a house, my parents drained their retirement account to give them a down payment for a sprawling suburban home with a 3-car garage and a pool. There was no discussion of it being a loan. It was a gift, a coronation for the family's reigning princess and her new prince. A year later, I bought my own place, a small, one-bedroom condo in the city, financed with a down payment I had painstakingly saved since my first job. I was proud of it. When I told my parents, my mother's response was, "Oh, that's nice, dear. Is it in a safe neighborhood?" When they came to see it, they walked through the 700-square-foot space with polite, tight smiles. "It's very cozy," Mark had commented, looking at the galley kitchen as if it were a public health hazard. "Very you, Nora." I should have stopped hoping then. I should have accepted that my role in the family was to be the sensible, low-maintenance, self-sufficient daughter who never asked for anything and therefore never received anything. I was the responsible one, the quiet one, the one who was easy to forget. But a tiny, stubborn part of me still yearned for a place at the table. I didn't know then that I was about to be offered a stool in the corner instead. The invitation, as it were, did not arrive on embossed cardstock or even in a thoughtfully worded email. It came, as most family commands did, via a terse text message from my mother 3 days before the event. "Chloe's 30th at the Gilded Spoon on Saturday. Be there at 7. There was no "Hi Nora," no "Hope you can make it," no "Love, Mom." It was a summons, a directive stripped of all warmth. My phone screen glowed in the dim light of my living room, the words hanging in the air like a puff of cold smoke. The Gilded Spoon. I'd heard of it, of course. It was one of those new, ridiculously expensive restaurants downtown that food critics either worshipped or despised for its sheer audacity. A place where a single appetizer could cost more than my weekly grocery bill. It was so quintessentially Chloe. My first instinct was to say no. A wave of exhaustion washed over me just thinking about it. I pictured the evening, the forced smiles, the conversations swirling around topics I had no part in: Chloe and Mark's upcoming trip to Tuscany, the renovation of their master bathroom, the latest gossip from their country club. I would be a ghost at the feast, a silent observer on the periphery, and I would have to pay for the privilege by enduring Mark's condescending pleasantries and my sister's thinly veiled barbs. I typed out a reply. "Sorry, I can't make it. Have a work thing." It was simple, clean, and final. My thumb hovered over the send button, but I hesitated. A small, treacherous voice in the back of my mind began to whisper, "It's her 30th birthday, Nora. It's a milestone. If you don't go, you're the one making it a problem. You're the one being difficult." It was the voice of years of conditioning, the voice that always urged me to smooth things over, to keep the peace, to swallow my own feelings for the sake of a fragile family harmony that only ever seemed to benefit everyone but me. Maybe this time would be different, the voice lied. Maybe, on her 30th birthday, Chloe would be magnanimous. Maybe my parents would make an effort to include me. Maybe the grand setting would inspire a grand gesture of kindness. Hope is a stubborn, irrational weed. No matter how many times you cut it down, it finds a way to grow back in the cracks of your certainty. I deleted the text and wrote a new one. "Sounds great, see you then." I stared at my reply, a knot tightening in my stomach. I was already dreading it. To fortify myself, I went online and ordered Chloe a birthday gift, an expensive leather travel bag from a brand she'd once mentioned. It was far more than I should have spent, but I saw it as a kind of peace offering, a down payment on a pleasant evening. If I showed up with a generous gift, how could they be anything but gracious in return? It was a transaction. I was buying my ticket to their acceptance. On Saturday evening, the dread returned with a vengeance. I stood in front of my closet, feeling like nothing I owned was good enough for the Gilded Spoon. My professional work clothes felt too stuffy, my casual clothes too plain. I finally settled on a simple, elegant black dress that I'd worn to a colleague's wedding. It was understated but classic. As I did my makeup, I tried to give myself a pep talk in the mirror. "Just for a few hours," I said to my reflection. "Smile, ask questions, give her the gift. It will be over before you know it. Don't let them get to you." My reflection looked back at me, unconvinced. The flicker of hope from a few days ago had been extinguished, replaced by a grim resignation. I wasn't going to keep the peace. I was going to be its casualty. I grabbed the large, beautifully wrapped gift bag and my purse, my hand trembling slightly as I locked my condo door behind me. The ride downtown felt like a journey to my own execution. I tried to listen to music, but the cheerful melodies just felt jarring. All I could hear was the frantic beating of my own heart, a drum signaling the start of a battle I already knew I was going to lose. I just didn't know yet that this time, losing would be the only way to win. The gilded spoon was even more ostentatious than I had imagined. The entrance was flanked by two enormous bronze statues of what looked like mythical birds, and the valet, dressed in a crisp, dark uniform, looked at my sensible sedan with a flicker of disdain before taking the keys. Inside, the restaurant was a cavern of dark wood, gold leaf, and shimmering crystal. The air was thick with the scent of money, a subtle blend of expensive perfume, rich food, and leather. The low hum of conversation was punctuated by the clinking of heavy silverware against porcelain. I gave the hostess Chloe's name, and she led me through the maze of tables toward a private alcove at the back. I could hear their laughter before I saw them. It was a loud, unrestrained sound, the kind of laughter that comes from people who are used to being the center of attention. They were all there, gathered around a large, circular table draped in white linen. My parents, Richard and Helen, Chloe and Mark, and a few of their equally polished-looking friends. Chloe was seated at the head of the table, a paper crown comically perched on her perfectly styled blonde hair. She was holding court, a glass of champagne in one hand, gesturing wildly as she told a story. No one noticed me approach. I stood there for what felt like a full minute, the hostess having melted away, leaving me hovering awkwardly at the edge of their bubble of merriment. The gift bag in my hand suddenly felt heavy and foolish. Finally, my mother glanced up and saw me. Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Oh, Nora, you made it." The laughter at the table died down as all eyes turned to me. It felt like a spotlight had been switched on. Chloe's radiant smile faltered, replaced by a look of mild annoyance, as if a cloud had just passed in front of her son. "Oh, hi, Nora," she said, her tone flat. There was no "I'm so glad you could come" or "happy to see you," just a dull acknowledgement of my presence. I forced a smile, stepping forward. "Happy birthday, Chloe." I held out the gift bag. "This is for you." She didn't reach for it. Mark, her husband, leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. He looked me up and down, his gaze lingering for a moment on my simple black dress before meeting my eyes. "Nora," he said, his voice dripping with false geniality. "Good of you to show up." Chloe finally waved a dismissive hand toward an empty space on the floor beside her chair. "Just put it over there." She then turned to the waiter standing discreetly nearby and said, "Another bottle of the Veuve, please." She hadn't even looked at the gift. I placed the bag on the floor, feeling a hot blush creep up my neck. The conversation at the table was already starting to resume, leaving me standing there, an uninvited guest at my own family's party. I looked around the table. There were 8 place settings, and all 8 chairs were filled. There was no seat for me. My heart sank. This was a new level of exclusion. They hadn't even saved me a spot. It was Chloe who delivered the final, crushing blow. She seemed to notice my confusion, her eyes flicking from my face to the full table and back again. She picked up a folded linen napkin from beside her plate. "Oh, right," she said, as if just remembering a trivial detail. She stood up and walked over to me. "We didn't count you when we pre-ordered the 5-course tasting menu," she said, her voice a stage whisper that was perfectly audible to everyone at the table. She pressed the napkin into my hand. "So there isn't really a place, or food." She then pointed a perfectly manicured finger toward a dark corner of the alcove, near a service station where waiters collected empty glasses. Tucked away against the wall was a single, high-backed bar stool. It was clearly not part of the dining setup. It was an afterthought, a piece of furniture meant for waiting, not participating. "You can sit over there, though," she offered, as if this were a tremendous act of generosity. The world seemed to slow down. The ambient noise of the restaurant faded to a dull roar in my ears. I could feel the sympathetic, pitying eyes of the waiter on me and the smug, triumphant gaze of my brother-in-law. My own parents looked down at their plates, their silence a deafening form of consent. They were sanctioning this. They were allowing it to happen. As I stood there, frozen in a state of pure distilled humiliation, Mark chimed in, twisting the knife. "You should be grateful you're even here, Nora," he said, taking a sip of his champagne. "Chloe wanted this to be just for her real friends, but you know, family is family." The implication was clear. I wasn't a real friend. I wasn't even real family. I was an obligation, a box to be ticked, and I was expected to be thankful for any scrap of attention they threw my way. Something inside me should have snapped. I should have thrown the napkin in her face. I should have turned around and walked out, my head held high. I should have said something, anything, to defend the last shred of my dignity. But I didn't. Decades of conditioning took over. Don't make a scene, don't be difficult, don't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I gave a tight, bloodless nod. I clutched the napkin in my hand, my knuckles white. And I walked to the corner stool. I sat down, and I ate in silence. Sitting on that stool was like being placed behind a one-way mirror. I could see and hear everything with a painful clarity, but I was completely invisible to them. The stool was too high for the low-slung table, forcing me to either crane my neck down or stare at the wall. I chose the wall. It was covered in a dark, patterned damask wallpaper that seemed to absorb all the light in the room. I focused on the intricate swirls, tracing them with my eyes, trying to dissociate from the scene just a few feet away. The first course arrived. It was some kind of delicate seafood tower, presented with artistic flair. The sounds of my family's delight were sharp and clear, the oohs and ahs, the clinking of tiny forks against mother-of-pearl spoons, the effusive compliments to Chloe on her excellent choice of restaurant. The rich aroma of garlic, lemon, and butter drifted over to my corner, a phantom feast I was not allowed to partake in. My stomach growled in protest, a small, private betrayal. A young waiter, not the one serving their table, approached me cautiously. He had kind eyes, filled with an unmistakable pity that was almost harder to bear than my family's cruelty. "Ma'am," he whispered, "can I get you something, a glass of water?" I could only nod, my throat too tight to speak. He returned a moment later with a tall glass of ice water and a small basket containing a single, warm bread roll on a tiny plate. He set it down on the corner of the service station next to me. "On the house," he murmured, and then quickly retreated. I stared at the bread roll. It was the saddest, most welcome sight I had ever seen. I broke off a tiny piece and put it in my mouth, the simple taste of baked dough feeling like the most luxurious meal. I ate it slowly, rationing it, making it last through their next two courses, a wild mushroom risotto and a duck confit that Mark declared was life-altering. As the dinner wore on, the wine flowed freely. With each new bottle, the volume of their conversation rose. They toasted to Chloe's beauty, to her success, to her future. My father, Richard, stood to make a speech. He spoke of his pride in his brilliant, beautiful firstborn, recounting anecdotes from her childhood, her first ballet recital, her victory in a school debate. He spoke of her as if she were his only child. He never once looked in my direction. My mother, Helen, dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, her face a mask of maternal adoration. At one point, during a lull in the conversation, my mother's gaze did drift over to my corner. Our eyes met for a brief second. I saw a flicker of something in her expression. Was it guilt? Discomfort? Pity? For a moment, I thought she might say something, perhaps call me over, insist that a chair be brought to the table. But then Chloe laughed loudly at something one of her friends said, and my mother's attention snapped back to her, the moment broken. She turned away, and the flicker was gone, leaving only the placid, smiling mask she always wore. She had made her choice, as she always did. I wasn't just an outsider. I was an auditor, a silent witness to my own erasure. And as a financial analyst, my mind began to do what it does best. It started running the numbers. 5-course tasting menu at, I estimated, at least $250 per person. 8 people. That was $2,000 right there. Then the wine. The view of Cliquot champagne they were drinking like water retailed for about $60 a bottle, which meant the restaurant was likely charging over $150. I'd counted at least 6 empty bottles. That was another $900. Add in cocktails, mineral water, a generous tip, and taxes, and the bill was easily going to crest $3,500, maybe even $4,000. It was an obscene amount of money for a single meal. And then I remembered something else. Something that made the numbers in my head rearrange themselves into a far more interesting equation. About 3 months ago, my father had called me late on a Tuesday night. He sounded distressed, his voice strained. He asked if I could meet him for coffee the next morning and stressed that I shouldn't mention it to Chloe or my mother. I'd met him at a quiet diner where, over weak coffee, the truth had spilled out. His bravado had crumbled, and he'd confessed with tears in his eyes that they were in serious financial trouble. A series of bad investments, coupled with years of funding Chloe's extravagant lifestyle, had decimated their savings. The second mortgage they'd taken out for her college tuition was now a crushing weight, and their retirement account, plundered for her house down payment, was a ghost of its former self. He had come to me, his practical, independent daughter, the financial analyst, for help. He was ashamed, humiliated, but desperate. He spread out bank statements on the diner table, and I had stared at the stark, unforgiving numbers. They were in a precarious position. For the next several weeks, I had worked with him in secret. I'd created a strict budget, helped him consolidate debts, and set up a long-term plan to get them back on their feet. It would take years of discipline and austerity. The lavish gifts, the spontaneous trips, the bankrolling of Chloe and Mark's life, it all had to stop. I remembered a specific conversation we'd had about this upcoming birthday. Chloe wants a big party, he'd told me, his face pale with worry. At some fancy place downtown. You have to tell her no, I'd said firmly. You can't afford it, you have to be honest with her. He had promised he would. A week later, he told me he'd done it. I told her we could host a nice dinner for her at the house, but that a big restaurant party was out of the question this year, he'd said, a note of relief in his voice. She was upset, but I think she understood. Clearly, she hadn't understood, or more likely, she hadn't believed him. She had heard his no as a maybe, confident that when the time came, he would cave, just as he always had. She had called his bluff, booking the party anyway, assuming the comforting safety net of her parents. Money would magically appear beneath her. But I knew the truth. I was the only one in that room, besides my father, who knew the safety net was gone. A strange sense of calm washed over me. The humiliation, the anger, the hurt, it was all still there, but it was now overlaid with a cold, hard clarity. This wasn't just another family dinner. This was a house of cards, and a gale-force wind was coming. I finished my water, my back straight, my gaze fixed on the unfolding drama. I was no longer a victim in the corner. I was a spectator with a front-row seat. Just as the plates from the main course were being cleared, the lights in the alcove dimmed slightly. A hush fell over the table, replaced by a ripple of excited anticipation. 2 waiters emerged from the kitchen, one of them holding a magnificent, 3-tiered cake ablaze with 30 lit candles. It was a confectioner's masterpiece, decorated with delicate sugar flowers and gold leaf that shimmered in the candlelight. Chloe clasped her hands together in performative glee. "Oh, Mark, you did!" she cried, though it was obvious she had known all about it. They placed the cake in front of her, and the table erupted into a boisterous, slightly off-key rendition of Happy Birthday. I watched from my corner, a silent observer to the ceremony. No one looked over. No one beckoned me to join in. As the song finished, Chloe took a deep breath and blew out all the candles in one go, to a round of applause. Slices of the rich chocolate cake were served to everyone at the table. A waiter started to walk toward me, a plate in his hand, but Mark caught his eye and gave a subtle shake of his head. The waiter stopped, looking confused, then turned and went back to the service station. Not even a slice of cake. The message was absolute. I was not part of this celebration. I was not to be fed. The party began to wind down. The friends started gathering their things, exchanging air kisses and promising to do this again soon. As they departed, it was just the four of them left at the table, my parents, Chloe and Mark, basking in the afterglow of a successful event. It was then that the head waiter, a tall, imposing man with a severe expression, approached the table. He moved with a silent, deliberate grace that signaled the end of the evening's festivities. In his hand, he held a black leather bill folder. He walked directly to the head of the table and, with a slight bow, placed the folder on the white linen cloth directly in front of my father. "Sir," he said, his voice a low, professional murmur. Chloe and Mark were still laughing about something one of their friends had said. Chloe glanced at the bill folder and then at my father with a breezy, confident smile. "Time to pay the piper, Daddy," she chirped, completely at ease. Mark leaned back, patting his full stomach, the picture of satisfaction. My father stared at the leather folder as if it were a venomous snake. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for it. He opened it. I couldn't see the final number from my corner, but I didn't need to. I saw it on his face. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a pasty, grayish pallor. His jaw went slack, and his eyes widened in sheer panic. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. My mother, sensing his distress, leaned over. She peered into the folder, and a small, sharp gasp escaped her lips. She brought a hand to her chest, her own carefree expression dissolving into one of horror. The bill, I would later learn, was for $8,750. The champagne, the premium menu, and automatic. 20% gratuity for a large party, and city taxes had inflated the cost to a truly breathtaking sum. Chloe, oblivious, was scrolling through photos on her phone. "Can you believe how good I look in this lighting?" she said, holding up her phone to Mark. "What's wrong?" Mark asked, finally noticing the funereal silence that had fallen over my parents. He looked at my father, whose face was now a mask of sheer terror. My father closed the folder with a snap. He looked at Chloe, his voice a strained, broken whisper. "Chloe, I can't." Chloe looked up from her phone, her brow furrowed in annoyance. "Can't what, Daddy? Don't be so dramatic. Just give him your card." "No, you don't understand," he said, his voice gaining a desperate edge. He shook his head, looking from his wife to his daughter. "I can't pay this. We don't have the money." The statement hung in the air, heavy and impossible. Chloe stared at him, her smile frozen on her face. Then she let out a short, sharp laugh as if he'd just told a terrible joke. "That's not funny. Pay the man, Dad, you're embarrassing me." Mark's smug demeanor had vanished, replaced by a dark scowl. He looked between my father and the waiting maitre d', his face flushing with a mixture of anger and humiliation. "Richard, what is this?" he demanded. "What's going on?" "I told you, Chloe," my father pleaded, his voice cracking. "I told you we couldn't do this, not this year. I told you we could have something at the house." The reality of the situation finally crashed down on Chloe. Her face contorted, disbelief warring with a rising tide of fury. "What are you talking about?" she shrieked, her voice shrill enough to turn the heads of the few remaining patrons in the restaurant. "You always pay, you're my father, it's your job." The scene was mesmerizing in its awfulness. The Golden family, the picture of effortless wealth and success, was imploding in a public forum of their own choosing. The head waiter stood his ground, his expression unreadable but his posture rigid. This was no longer a celebration, it was a hostage situation, and the ransom was $8,750. As my father stammered, unable to form a coherent sentence, and my mother began to weep silently into her napkin, their eyes began to scan the room in a desperate search for a savior. And then, as one, they all turned and looked at me. The silence in the alcove was suddenly absolute. The distant clatter of the kitchen, the soft music from the speakers, it all faded away. All I could hear was the frantic thumping of my own heart. 4 pairs of eyes were fixed on me, sitting in my corner of shame. It was a moment of stunning, breathtaking irony. The forgotten one, the uncounted one, was now their only hope. My father's eyes were pleading, filled with a desperate, pathetic hope. My mother's were wet with tears, her expression a silent appeal for me to fix this, to smooth it over, to make the bad feelings go away as I was always expected to do. Mark's gaze was hard and demanding, an unspoken order. But it was Chloe who broke the silence. Her face, which moments ago had been a mask of rage, was now calculating. The gears were turning in her mind, seeing a clear and simple solution to her problem. "Well," she snapped, her voice sharp and imperious. "Don't just sit there, Nora, you can cover it." She said it with such confidence, such absolute certainty. As if it were the most natural thing in the world. As if I were a walking ATM, put on this earth for the sole purpose of bailing her out of her self-inflicted crises. "You're the one with all the money, right?" she added, a bitter, resentful edge to her voice. "The big-shot financial analyst, this is nothing for you." Every head in the room was turned towards me. The head waiter, who had been watching the family drama unfold with practiced neutrality, now looked at me with open curiosity. This was the final act. For my entire life, I had been cast in a supporting role, the quiet character who existed only to prop up the star. They had handed me the script, and my line was simple: pay the bill, save the day, and restore the comfortable family order. Everyone was waiting for me to say my line. And in that moment, a lifetime of slights, big and small, coalesced into a single, unassailable point of clarity. I saw the pony on my 8th birthday. I saw myself working late shifts at the diner to pay for textbooks while Chloe flew to Cancun. I saw my parents' proud smiles as they handed her the keys to a house they'd paid for, and their polite, distant smiles as they stood in my tiny condo. I felt the weight of the gift bag I'd bought her, still sitting unopened on the floor. I felt the phantom hunger in my stomach from the meal I was never offered. I felt the cold, hard wood of the stool beneath me, and the useless linen napkin still clutched in my hand. All the years I had spent making myself smaller, quieter, and less demanding, all in the hope of earning a fract. Ion of the love they gave her so freely, it had all been for nothing. They didn't see me, they had never seen me. They only saw a utility, a resource to be tapped when their primary one ran dry. A strange calm settled over me. The knot of anxiety that had lived in my stomach for 28 years finally, blessedly, unraveled. Slowly I stood up. The movement was deliberate, unhurried. I smoothed down the front of my black dress. I did not look at Chloe or Mark or my parents. I looked directly at the head waiter, whose stern expression had now softened into one of intrigued anticipation. He was the one they had a contract with. He was the one who needed an answer. I took a step forward, out of the shadows of my corner. And then, I raised my hand and pointed a steady, unwavering finger. Not at my father, not at the bill, but at the grand table, at my sister and her husband, sitting amidst the ruins of their extravagant party. My voice, when it came out, was quiet, clear, and steady. It held no anger, no malice, no triumph. It held only the simple, undeniable power of the truth. "I wasn't invited," I said, my gaze locked with the waiter's. "Remember." I didn't wait for a reaction. I didn't need one. My part in this drama was over. I turned my back on all of it, on the 5-course meal, on the 3-tiered cake, on the $8,750 bill, and on the 4 stunned faces of the people I had once called my family. I walked out of the alcove, my footsteps echoing softly on the polished wood floor. I walked past the other tables, past the bronze bird statues, and out through the heavy doors into the cool, clean night air. The valet brought my sensible sedan around. I handed him a tip, got in the car, and drove away. As I merged onto the highway, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years washed over me. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was something more profound. It was lightness. The crushing weight I had carried on my shoulders for my entire life was finally gone. I was free. The drive home was a blur. I don't remember the traffic or the route I took. All I remember is the profound silence in my car, a silence that felt peaceful rather than empty. When I walked back into my condo, my cozy, safe, 700-square-foot sanctuary, I felt like I was breathing for the first time. Predictably, my phone started exploding within 30 minutes. The first call was from Chloe. I let it go to voicemail. The message she left was a torrent of incoherent rage. She called me selfish, cruel, and a traitor. She screamed about how I had humiliated her on her birthday, how I had ruined everything. There was no apology, no self-awareness, just pure, uncut fury that I had refused to play my designated part. Next came a text from Mark. "You will regret this, Nora, I promise you." A threat. It was so typical of him that I almost laughed. Then came the messages from my mother. They started as frantic texts. "Nora, please call me. We need to talk," and quickly devolved into long, rambling paragraphs of guilt and manipulation. She wrote about the importance of family, about forgiveness, about how I had broken my father's heart. She painted me as the villain, the cold-hearted daughter who had abandoned her family in their moment of need. She detailed how they had been forced to make a humiliating arrangement with the restaurant manager, leaving Mark's credit card and Chloe's new designer watch as collateral until they could figure out how to pay the bill. She conveniently omitted the part where they had created the entire situation themselves. I read each message, and for the first time they had no power over me. The words were just words, the desperate flailing of people who had lost control. I blocked Chloe's number, I blocked Mark's. I silenced the text thread from my mother. My finger hovered over my father's contact. He hadn't called or texted. The next morning, a single message from him finally appeared. 4 simple words. "I understand, I am sorry." Tears welled in my eyes. It wasn't a solution. It didn't erase decades of neglect. But it was something. It was an acknowledgement. It was the truth. It was a crack of light in a door I thought was sealed shut forever. I didn't reply, not yet. But I didn't block his number either. The weeks that followed were quiet. The storm had passed, leaving behind a strange and peaceful landscape. I went to work, saw my friends, and enjoyed the simple solitude of my own home. The absence of my family's constant, low-grade drama was like the cessation of a chronic headache. I hadn't realized how much it had been hurting me until it stopped. I know that the relationship with my sister and her husband is over. It was never a relationship to begin with, it was a hierarchy, and I have abdicated my position at the bottom. The bond with my mother is broken, too, perhaps irreparably. Her refusal to see the truth, her allegiance to the family narrative over her own child's well-being, is a betrayal I don't know. How to forgive. My father is a more complicated story. His apology was a start. Perhaps, one day, we can build something new from the rubble, a relationship based not on obligation or old roles, but on a fragile, newfound honesty. But for now, I am content with the quiet. I am no longer waiting for an invitation to a table where I will never be welcome. I am building my own table, in my own home, and the only people who will have a seat are the ones who see me, who value me, and who would never, ever hand me a napkin and point me to a corner. I may be dining alone for now, but for the first time in my life, I am not lonely. I am simply at peace, finally counting myself as enough.